morning. I'll call the meeting of the National Board of Assessors to order at 9 a.m. on Thursday, January 20th, 2022. Let the record show that present from the board are Robert Early, Paul Bergeron, and myself, Daniel Hansberry. First order of business is the meeting minutes from the last meeting. Is there a motion to waive the reading of the minutes from the board meeting of January 6, 2022, accept them and place them on file?
So moved.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Are there any errors or corrections? Seeing none, all those in favor of accepting the minutes as presented signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, say nay. Ayes have it. Motion carries. Is there a motion to waive the reading of the non-public meeting minutes from the board meeting of January 6, 2022? Accept them and place them on file.
So moved.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Are there any errors or corrections? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, say nay. Ayes have it. Motion carries. At this time, the board will recognize Tim Cummings, who is Director of Economic Development, who has a presentation regarding the National Performing Arts Center. Good morning and welcome, Mr. Cummings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and through you to the board. For the record, Tim Cummings, Director of Economic Development. And it's okay if I sit here. I have some slides that I'd like to go over with you this morning, which hopefully will give this body a better understanding of the new market tax credit transaction that the city undertook back in December of 2020. I know that this issue came up a couple months back, and I think it's great that I'm able to come here before you this morning to provide you a broad overview of how we structured the transaction, and I'm available today and moving forward if any questions arise, because this is a relatively complicated transaction. So I'm going to just share screen here so everyone on Zoom. Oh, who is the host?
Director Kleiner, I believe, hosts it, correct? Isn't that right?
Diane, do you have this share screen on? Under security, go up and then you just check it off?
Okay, let me check.
Yep, look at under security and then share screen, you need it to be checked.
It is now checked.
Okay. I think we're okay, Director Cummings.
Thank you. All right, so now people can actually see what you have as well as a handout, and I provided one to the assessing staff for the minutes and record-keeping purposes. So the following pages were taken from a presentation given to the Board of Aldermen on November 24th, 2020, when the city adopted R-20-094. It was an omnibus resolution authorizing the new market tax credit transaction, and I believe the following pages will help the conversation this morning and give everyone a better understanding of the transaction. So I'm not going to read this memo. I did that on the November 24th meeting, but essentially the big takeaway I want everyone to understand is a new market tax credit is trying to line the dials of a law. And what do I mean by that? So every transaction is somewhat different, and there are standard rules that you need to comply with to be able to effectuate the transaction. So you need to make sure that everything is in alignment to unlock the potential benefit that you'll receive. The other point that I want to make sure I call out here is we had a very sophisticated consulting team work on putting this new market tax credit transaction together. Internally on city staff, it was Celia Leonard and I want to take a moment and recognize Attorney Leonard, who is with us this morning via Zoom. Celia, thanks for making the time. But then in addition to that, we had some outside new market tax credit consultants. John Kaminsky is a tax credit attorney who works in Maine but specializes in tax credit financing throughout New England, and he was our outside tax counsel on the transaction. Neil Cannon is a a real estate and development consultant. He has actually done every single new market tax credit transaction in the state of New Hampshire. He's very, very well respected within the industry. He actually got the first CDE, and I'll explain that in a little bit, up and running here in the state of New Hampshire back in the early 2000s. And then lastly, we had Andy Perlman, local attorney here in the city, to help us with some other miscellaneous real estate items that came up along the way. So essentially what the real bulk of the slides is a visual aid to show you how the funds flowed. And I'm going to just rotate this here. Okay, so this isn't letting me rotate the... No, I don't know why, but this is, for some reason, this is not letting me rotate. Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay, so, up in the very top, let's start at the top box here, sources of funds. So this just calls out that the city put into the project $21 million. Now, technically, what we did was we put $15.5 million in through one bonding authorization. That was very early on in the process. And then later on, we did another $5 million bond, which we recognized was going to be through a tax increment financing type of process with the School Street development. We can talk a little bit about that if you'd like later on, but essentially from the outsider agency's perspective, from Wall Street's perspective, from a bonding and agency's perspective, the city of Nashua basically put in $21 million. And then we have new market tax credit equity of $2.44 million. And then Nashua Community Arts put into the project $1.553 million.
So Director Cummings, if I can ask a question as we go along. So the $2.4 million, can you explain that or define that?
I will. Further down, I'll get into more details as to how that actually comes into play. So that's a great question. But the reason why I'm calling this out is because the big thing that you need to understand is we have a $25 million project. And through these various sources of funds, we got to $25 million. The last item in this box is, and again, this is really just nuanced, and it's really not that important in the overall structure, but something I do want to call your attention to is technically $22 million went to one entity to do the development of the building, and due to IRS rules, we had to separate just over $2 million, about $2.4 million, and put that aside through another legal entity, again, just all for IRS compliance reasons. And that was for furniture, fixtures, and equipment. Again, I'll get into that a little bit later on. But if you add these up, the total is $25 million, and it correlates with the uses just above it. So now that we've set the framework or the grounding of how we are actually going to finance the project, how do we actually get, as you point out, Mr. Chair, the $2.446 million in equity? So Mascoma Savings Bank, or Mascoma Bank out in Claremont, New Hampshire, has a very strong interest in community development, and they have created an entity called a community development entity, a CDE, and they call it Mascoma Community Development. And that is a separate arm of the bank that does tax credit type financing. And to qualify for a new market tax credit, you need to work with a CDE. And in fact, a CDE is the only legal entity in the country that can actually broker or transact a new market tax credit. They receive an allocation directly from U.S. Treasury, and they then have to go out and deploy that allocation within their geographical footprint, or essentially whatever they committed to into their application to Treasury. So Mascoma CDE, after some time, recognized the project and the value and said to the city of Nashua, yes, we will give you an allocation. Now, when I refer to the allocation, they got a $60 million, in this round, a $60 million set aside from Treasury. That was their allocation. That $60 million translates into, in this particular project, a qualified equity investment of $9.75 million. So, out of that $60 million allocation, a QEI, excuse me, of 975 of that $60 million is basically being used for the city of Nashua's project. So, they create an investment fund, and they put in a new market tax credit equity of 2.889, I think, and when all said and done, it comes out to about 2.446 million after the fees. How do we get there? So the city of Nashua authorized $21 million, and we set aside 13 million and change. And if you follow what I'm doing, that comes from the city of Nashua and goes straight down to 201 Main Street Real Estate Corp. And that 13 and change is part of that $21 million. The difference, that $7 million, $7,100,000, gets sent through. This is basically the system we created to leverage the money to be able to get the equity, the 2.44 million. So then the 2.1 million is given as a loan to 201 Main Street Financing Corp. And then 201 Main Street Financing Corp, which is a 162G entity that the city of Nashua created as a special purpose entity, basically to loan out this money for the project. And they in turn immediately put as a loan into the NPAC investment fund 7.1 million. That, coupled with the equity investment. And how do we get the equity investment? So as I mentioned, there was this 975 QEI that the Mascoma Community Development basically said that they would commit to the project. That is the qualified equity investment. Now, the new market tax credit rules say that you can claim up to 39% of your investment. So 39% of the 9.75 is something like 3 million, 3.8, or yeah, 3.8 million. That is what 39% of this 975 is. And then there are some fees and some transaction costs that are taken away or subtracted. So you net out to the 2.4, you net out the fees at 246,000. It brings you down to 975. And so that 975 gets split out two different ways when it comes to the MPAC Corporation. And that is actually the entity that is developing, owning, and actually doing the Performing Arts Center for the time being, for the next 7 years. And so 7 million got passed down as what was referred to as Loan A, and then a second loan, because you have to give it as a loan to comply with IRS rules, The $2.446 million comes to you as a loan, and that gets passed on down to the MPAC Corporation. So now you have 975 plus the 13, and then we had National Community Arts bring in that 1.553 up through the system here, which got you to that, essentially that $22 million. And I say that $22 million because if you recall, we did not pass on through all of it to NPAC Corp. We needed to through 201 Main Street, 201 Main Street Real Estate Corp., which is again another 162G entity that the city created, retained about 2.4 million for FF&E, which is directly leased to, and the beneficiary of is the city of Nashua as the master tenant. And so, again, we created a special purpose entity to do the lending, 201 Main Street Financing Corp. We created 201 Main Street Real Estate Corp. to essentially help with the FF&E and then to pass on through to NPAC Corp. Because NPAC Corp. is actually a for-profit company that was created to execute on this project. And so, and it is this entity that essentially, and I'll get to this a little bit later on, owns what is referred to as 201 Main Street, the building itself. So we, from there, have a master tenant lease for the entire building. And I say we, I'm referring back to the city of Nashua. So the city of Nashua started up here, and here we are back over here, where we are the master tenant of 201 Main Street, and we have the rights to the building and whatnot for its usage. And we created an operating agreement. And that operating agreement basically allows a third-party manager of the building that reports back to the city of Nashua to actually execute on the Performing Arts Center daily activities. That is, in essence, essentially how the transaction came about. Now, when you asked about the $2.44 million as equity, I said it came as a loan, but the way the loan is structured in Loan B, it's structured to be forgivable after 7 years, and that debt, because of how the note was written, gets converted into equity. And so it just, we have, after a 7-year compliance period, it just gets, the loan note gets forgiven, and that $2.446 million stays in the project, and there's no expectation that that money needs to come out of it.
In the other $7 million, are we liable for the other $7 million?
Yes, I mean, in the sense that it's a loan that was made into the project, and we have an obligation to repay it, the city of Nashua.
So it's not a grant then?
No, it was a loan. Well, let me rephrase. For this purposes, it came through as a loan, but at the end of the day, the city of Nashua has an obligation to pay the debt service on $21 million. So that 7 and that 13 needs to be paid by the city of Nashua to be in compliance.
Thank you.
I think just to further, expand on that, what we don't need to do is pay the $2.446 million. That small gap of about 10% of the project, essentially, we don't need to pay for. Now, why did we do this? Some people may be looking at this and saying, "Wow, that's a really complicated transaction. You went through all this effort. Why?" Because as I said, the direct benefit was only about 10% of the total project cost. It's because there was an obligation when we got the authorization of that $21 million, or technically the $15.5 million bond authorization. there was language written into that resolution that said $4 million of non-city money needed to come into the project. And how did we get to that $4 million? We had 1.5 come in, 1.55 come in from Nashua Community Arts, and then we had new market tax credit equity of 2.44. You add that up, gets you to the $4 million. We met that threshold that allowed us to move the project forward. Just going on here, so here is essentially the same slide, but it calls out the approvals that we had to go through to be able to make the transaction happen. And so I think something that is probably very important from your perspective is that the city of Nashua, through R20-094, in approval number 2, I think, and don't hold me to that, but essentially in one of the earlier approvals in that omnibus resolution, we actually sold 201 Main Street to NPAC Corp. And that's what this line basically shows, is we sold that asset to the NPAC Corporation. And so that means that building is not held by the city of Nashua right now in title. And so then NPAC Corporation leased it to the city of Nashua. And so therefore, NPAC Corporation has a tax obligation. And so we understood this, and we knew that this was going to be part of the mechanics of how this deal was being transacted, and we projected out what the real estate taxes would be, because we knew we were going to have an obligation to pay those real estate taxes. So what happens is the city of Nashua, as a master tenant, pays the taxes to NPAC Corp., who then pays the taxes back to the city of Nashua. And we have to do that for IRS compliance reasons. We needed to have what's referred to as a triple net lease. NPAC Corporation needed to have a commercially viable recognized lease for it to comply with IRS standards. That meant that all the tax obligations needed to be passed on, and that's why the city of Nashua pays the taxes. But essentially, in our operating budget, we set it aside this year as a certain dollar amount. I think it was approximately $50,000, and we NPAC Corporation basically sent the city of Nashua an invoice. The city of Nashua wrote a check to NPAC Corporation, and then NPAC Corporation wrote a check back to the city of Nashua. So it's basically $50,000 had to go through this system to be legally compliant, but it's not an additional $50,000 into the city of Nashua. We just had to set it aside and pay our obligation. Any other questions that you may have?
Any others?
The fundraising.
Yeah.
So from day one, like if somebody came forward and donated $5 million, there was no intention of that money being used to defray the cost of construction. Is that correct?
No, no, there was,
Oh,
actually.
there was, okay.
Yeah, so this group right here essentially organized themselves, and they called themselves Nashua Community Arts. It's a 501c3, and they took on the responsibility of raising. They needed to, as the deal came together, they knew they needed to raise $1.55 million to make the transaction work. But they had done a feasibility study early on, and they believed that they could achieve about $2.5 million in private, commercial, philanthropic type of contributions to the project. They not only did they meet that goal, they've exceeded it. So what they did was they knew that 1.5 was going to go to the building construction to help offset costs. The additional $1 million that they have raised, actually, will go now to help with programming, deferred capital maintenance, other type of, we had to value engineer the building to make our budget at $25 million. I know that there was some things cut out that some of the folks would like to see added in. And so nothing has been decided upon, but of course, there's gonna be a conversation of, should we use some of this money for some of the things that we had to cut out of the project. So those conversations will actually unfold over the next few months. But they have raised to date, I would suggest somewhere just under $3 million.
And any money that's raised going forward, none of that would be used to retire the bond, is that correct?
That is a great question. That question has not been asked of Community Arts as of today to do any of that. That has not been the expectation, but there's no reason why they couldn't. And I don't know what their plan is other than that they want to use it to help offset some operational programming. For instance, they have talked about bringing in some community programming to help expose children and low-income students who might not otherwise be exposed to the arts, and help subsidize or pay for that type of programming that they need to pay for to be able to provide. So they've thought about doing those type of charitable contributions, community type of contributions.
All right, other questions for Director Cummings?
I don't have any.
I have a couple of questions. The NPAC Corporation, it's a subsidiary of 201 Main Street Real Estate Corp. Is 201 Main Street Real Estate Corp., is that, the city owns that?
No, well, that's a great question. The city does not own it, and to be more clear, the city does not control it. That is a public nonprofit, so it is a nonprofit that was constituted by the state of New Hampshire, and it had been deemed essentially to have been given governmental powers through 162G. And so therefore, it is similar to what the city of Nashua has with what we refer to as BIDA, Business Industrial Development Authority, where there are some actions that can be taken that the city of Nashua can't take, but can do through a private or a public nonprofit that has been given those powers and responsibilities.
It just seems that the city is basically paying for this, and then they gave it to NPAC?
Yep. Well, they sold it to NPAC, but yep, correct.
Sold it, and now the city is paying, is a tenant of that building that they paid for.
Correct.
Doesn't seem the way things should be. If the city paid for the building, why is it then a tenant of the building paying a rent?
I'm sorry, say that again?
I mean, maybe I misunderstood, but it seemed like the city paid for the building,
Yep.
but now the city ends up being a tenant of the building.
Yep.
That doesn't make sense to me. Like, why, if they build the building,
Yeah. Great question, because the city of Nashua cannot directly take advantage of the new market tax credit program. We cannot be the beneficiary of it. A private business needs to. So NPAC Corp is a for-profit business. They can take advantage of the new market tax credit. We, as the city of Nashua, cannot. So this model that was developed is actually a very tried and true model. We are not pioneers here. This has been done by a lot of other type of municipalities. I would say not very often, but has been done. And the city or the public agency or the entity is what is referred to as the master tenant, which basically gives it all the rights as like being an owner. And with that being said, and this is a fair point, this structure is only for 7 years. So at the end of the compliance period, some steps need to be taken, which is referred to as to unwind this transaction. And if folks so elect to do that, and that's what will need to be decided, 6 years from now, is that they could basically collapse this structure and make it much more efficient, and the building could go back into the possession of directly the city of Nashua come year 8. And that's very much understood and contemplated and part of, because the equity investor doesn't necessarily want to stay in the transaction until after they've received their entire benefit. Their entire benefit would be received within year 7. And so once they've received their entire benefit, they actually oftentimes want to exit the transaction as it's currently structured. You unwind everything that you've done, and then it becomes much more streamlined, and you very much would see the asset get transferred back to the city of Nashua.
Do you have a chart or something showing what the bottom line cost to the city is over, to start and then through the 7 years? I mean, it seems that it's hard to pinpoint how much this is costing the city and the taxpayers.
I mean, I don't have anything summarizing, but there are many different documents that show you the various costs that this project, is obligated to. What we do know is there's a, $21 million, 15 and a half, and another 5 general obligation bonds that the city of Nashua knows that we're gonna have to pay for. There's the taxes, but again, that's not new money. That is basically, a pass-through. And then the operational costs, to be clear, is not going to be an ongoing responsibility of the city of Nashua.
Right.
That is very much expected to be the spectacle management who is going to be paying the operational costs. So the utilities, the maintenance, the general maintenance, I should say. At some point, deferred capital maintenance will be an obligation of the city of Nashua. What has been built into the operator agreement, a differing type of revenue streams that can be collected and set aside for the benefit of trying to make sure we maintain the building and the asset. So, for instance, every ticket that is sold by Spectacle Management, I think it's $1, maybe $2 at the most, but will get set aside and needs to be given to the city of Nashua as a deferred capital maintenance fee. And so that would sit aside and that would accrue along with a few other miscellaneous items, merchandise sales, a certain percentage of food and beverage. And then I believe Spectacle Management has an obligation to put in something like 10 or 25,000 to that particular account as well, with the thought being is, come year 8, 9, 10, whatever it may be, there'll be, some money set aside for when major repairs need to be made on the building.
Okay, I don't have any other questions.
Are there other communities in New Hampshire that own performing arts centers? You said we could take ownership in 6 years. Are there others in the state?
There are other municipalities that have performing arts centers. Some are publicly owned. Laconia is the one that comes to mind off the top of my head. I would need to look back and see which ones are publicly owned and which ones may be run by a nonprofit or whatnot. But again, just off the top of my head, I can tell you Laconia has a performing arts center that they just constructed, and it was done directly by the municipality.
Mr. Bergeron, anything?
I don't have anything.
All right, well, any of the staff members have questions for Director Cummings? No. Thank you very much. This was very informative, very helpful. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Happy to come back anytime if you have any other questions or if any other questions arise.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. And I think I'm all set.
Mr. Vincent, do you have anything for us this morning?
No, I don't.
And so, Ms. Marchand?
Morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
I'm presenting an in-house correction for you this morning. The residential property is located at 27 Countryside Drive. And the basic information is that in 2019, an abatement was granted for some yard items that were inspected and deemed to be having no value any longer. And in 2021, our yard items were inadvertently added back onto the property record card with value. We have corrected this moving forward for 2022 and beyond, but for 2021, I recommend granting the in-house correction to remove the yard items from the property value and refund the owner any due taxes for those.
Questions for Ms. Marchand?
No?
No.
All right. Is there a motion to approve the in-house correction for the property located at 27 Countryside Drive?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, say nay. Ayes have it, motion carries. Does that conclude your report?
Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Let's see, unfinished business, there is none. Public comment, are there any people out in cyberspace waiting to comment, Ms. Fino?
I don't see anyone.
Okay. Are there any comments by board members?
No.
No.
All right. Is there a motion to go into non-public session for two reasons? First, to discuss matters which, if discussed in public, would likely affect adversely the reputation of any person other than a member of this board, unless such person requests an open meeting. This exemption shall extend to include any application for assistance or tax abatement, a waiver of a fee, fine, or other levy, if based on inability to pay or poverty of the applicant pursuant to RSA 91-A:3, Roman numeral 2, parenthetical C. Second, under 91-A:3, Roman numeral 2, parenthetical L, for the consideration of legal advice provided by legal counsel, either in writing or orally, to one or more members of the public body, even where legal counsel is not present.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
I will call the roll. Mr. Early?
Yes.
Mr. Bergeron?
Yes.
Mr. Hansberry, yes. Let the record show that we have entered non-public session at 9:37 a.m.